we're ready to go.
Hello?
We can hear you loud and clear. What's up, Agent Smith?
Oh, hey. How you doing?
Oh, today's been a bit of a struggle. It's just one of those days where, as a human being, as a living, breathing meatbag, not all of what you want to do goes through and you make mistakes in video games. But we made it to the Agent Smith time and we're ready to be graced by your amazing knowledge and expertise and all this cool stuff. And just have all those great meandering answers to meandering questions like we do.
Not naturally.
Cool. So, this week, what happened? Help us.
Well, I guess you could start with Venezuela,
Mm-hmm.
since I think last time we were talking a little bit about. I said that I wasn't really sure what direction they were going to go in with the Constitutional Assembly. And I think the next day they announced that they were going to officially vote to basically seize the powers of the National Assembly, the proper legal legislature. So that move to have the Constitutional Assembly be the new legislature is basically official and done.
Hmm.
Yeah, pretty bold power play there.
Yeah. We're replacing all of you with a new team. Bye.
Yeah, and they're almost all pro-government people since the opposition boycotted the Constitutional Assembly election. So Maduro's in a pretty good spot.
Hmm. That's pretty hardcore.
Yeah, ball's kind of in the legislature's court now. That is the National Assembly. We'll see what they do, if anything.
Mm-hmm. What can they do?
They can vote on things.
Okay. They'll just vote really hard.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, the powers of the state are in the executive branch and are controlled by the Maduro presidency. So
Mm-hmm.
there's nothing a Congress or a legislature can really do if the executive branch just outright turns on them.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they could hope that the courts kind of turn on them and vote, or rather rule that actions the executive branch are taking are illegal. But even if Venezuela's Supreme Court were not kind of on the side of Maduro, then it would fall to the executive branch to enforce that ruling. And again, the executive branch is controlled by Maduro. So even in that case, nothing would probably change.
He has all the cards.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's always the danger in any society. Once there's a breakdown in democratic norms, there's really nothing stopping whoever controls the state to just use the apparatus of state to do whatever they want. It's a very delicate balancing act. Basically just democratic norms that keeps any president or prime minister or whoever has control over a government from using that power to just make themselves permanent or to abuse that power. There's no way the Supreme Court in the United States, for example, can force a president to honor their rulings. They just kind of have to take it on faith that they're going to do that. And thus far through American history, almost every president has done that. And it's an established norm that the executive branch honors rulings by the judicial branch. But if they wanted to ignore a ruling, technically they could. And it's only something as fragile as a democratic norm that keeps them to that. And so in Venezuela, you're seeing what happens when that breaks down.
Yeah. Well, and then the final card is always the monopoly on violence, like we talked about for a while. So it seems like the military is on his side, so he has that card as well.
Yeah, it seems like the military is either neutral or on his side, so it doesn't look like they're going to be a vector of opposition there. That could change. They could surprise, but for now, they've been very quiet.
So one thing that I've seen was pretty much everyone who was on Trump's initial team is gone now. And there are a whole bunch of vacancies in the executive branch, and I don't quite know what that means, like, for the operation of the executive branch. Does he not care? Does that not affect us very much? If that's the case, then why do we even have those positions?
Well, a lot of that is a lot of positions in the executive branch thus far have not been filled yet and are awaiting appointments. That's been ongoing. The more recent thing was a whole bunch of people who had been on these basically industry councils of industry leaders who had kind of joined the administration in an informal capacity as advisors on economic issues. A lot of those people actually stepped down from those councils following the events in Charlottesville and following the comments of Trump himself regarding Charlottesville. So those positions were never formal positions, so it doesn't really hurt or hinder really to lose them, at least as far as the institution of government and the operation thereof. There was a change as far as there have been a number of changes within the Trump administration's team, the immediate staff. Steve Bannon was thrown out, and the chief of staff, Reince Priebus, I think his name was also thrown out and replaced with General Kelly. And that, it remains to be seen what the implications are there, but it could mean a move away from the economic nationalist sort of America First type position that Bannon represented. Although I've read some commentary that suggests Trump's problem was not so much with differences in policy with Bannon. He's probably still going to take the nationalist America First approach to policymaking, in so much as he has anyway. Rather, the difference may have been just personal. It's no stretch to wonder whether Trump would have a personal dispute with somebody. Obviously, he's pretty prone to them. But without Bannon and some of the other personnel changes, that could mean that the more conventional Republicans and conservative policymakers in the administration might get the upper hand over sort of these new populist forces. But again, that all remains to be seen. It's still early days. We'll see what happens with it. To kind of address the question, I guess you're kind of talking more about the positions in the executive branch that haven't been filled yet. Is that a problem then?
Yeah.
I mean, the apparatus of state can function without them. It's a pretty small percentage of jobs in the federal government that are political appointments. So it's quite possible for something like the State Department or what have you to continue to operate without a number of political appointments. There are kind of rules in place to kind of for when something like this happens, kind of, if there is a leadership vacuum, they are designed in a way that they can continue to function. It's just a little difficult without leadership because you're not really sure what you're supposed to be doing. You're just kind of winging it, so to speak. So they can still function, but they're not functioning as efficiently as they would if they had proper leadership, proper appointments. Part of Steve Bannon's perspective, and it's one that Trump himself may subscribe to, is that it's better they kind of want to dismantle the administrative state, weaken it. And one of the ways that you could do that is to just not appoint people to head departments. I'm not real sure what the long-term game plan would be there, though. I mean, like I said, the departments continue to function. And I don't think they're sufficiently dysfunctional as a result of a lack of appointments that you could, discredit them like they might want to. So, again, they have this idea that dismantling the administrative state is better for the economy and better for, the American identity, I guess. And it's just, it jives with their nationalist perspective, but it doesn't seem to be particularly well thought out. Maybe there's some aspect I'm missing that could be true too. Well, I just don't really see what the plan is there.
If you're interpreting things as a layperson who doesn't really know too much about politics, one of his main slogans during his running was "drain the swamp," and that's kind of like remove the bad people from politics. So if he's just kicking people off of his team, it kind of seems like he's doing that if you don't think about like how they're related to him and what all of that means. It kind of looks like a swamp draining, sort of. So he can probably pander to his base with that a little bit too. But yeah, these people are corrupt. Look how I'm taking out the corrupt people in Washington.
Yeah,
that's
definitely part of his core narrative there. Yeah, and he's very good at playing politics in that regard, using perspective. And he has enough faith amongst his supporters to kind of pull that off. The question people have been asking since he started running for president is how long he can pull that off, because he just bullshits so much and double talks and goes back on things he says so often. It's a question as to how much longer he can kind of do that. But, again, people have been asking that since he started running for president, and he hasn't stopped yet. It hasn't stopped working for him yet. So I think he'll probably keep his support probably throughout his presidency, almost no matter what happens. Whatever he does, there's so much enmity and distrust on the part of his supporters of other political actors in the American political system. I don't think there's a whole lot he could do to lose support. I think they're willing to give him his full 4 years. I don't know if the Republican Party is going to be willing to give him a full 4 years. They may turn on him. But that would be dangerous if he still has legitimate support amongst a good chunk of the population. The one thing Republicans really fear, more than anything the Democrats could do, is Trump's support, that sort of raw, red meat Republican base, turning on them, the establishment. So that's a state of play. Well, again, that's another see what happens situation.
We don't really have precedent for this type of presidency in most cases. I guess you have, Nixon with some sort of similar vibes?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much almost every president who's run since Nixon has run as an outsider candidate. But Nixon in particular, because he was so paranoid and because he went out of his way to point out, to kind of set himself in contrast to the establishment, to define himself in those terms. In that regard, there are strong similarities with the Trump administration and with Donald Trump himself. Nixon, though, was a little more, I don't know, almost well-adjusted, I guess. Nixon had some personality problems, but it's nothing compared to Donald Trump or anything he's done as of yet. But Nixon definitely had issues with establishment parties and suspected them greatly. Enough to have some of his people break into a hotel and try to steal information on his political rivals. That didn't work out for him too well.
No.
Yeah, I don't know if Trump is going to be that dumb.
We'll see.
We'll see. Yeah, it remains to be seen. Yeah, I did see the Trump administration said that they would investigate China's intellectual property policies. I don't really know what they're doing with that. I mean, it's pretty much guaranteed they'll find unfair practices. That's what I read anyway. Because there are issues with intellectual property theft in China, for sure. But, kind of the open question is what they're going to do about it. And, I mean, on the one hand, they could press them hard and, threaten them with, raising tariffs, sanctions, what have you, but the Chinese could retaliate, and the retaliation could be more damaging than any damage that's being caused presently with the intellectual property theft. And the game theory there would suggest just leaving it be then. So they might use it as leverage as far as North Korea, because another article I read suggested that the Trump administration values Chinese assistance on North Korea more than it values putting pressure on the Chinese as far as trade and trade issues. So this might just be an attempt to leverage the potential for action against China in the trade realm if they don't do more on North Korea. And thus far, China's been pretty cooperative as far as North Korea. After that ICBM test a while back, they slapped new sanctions on them in conjunction with UN, enhanced UN sanctions. So thus far, they've been relatively helpful. I think the Trump administration is getting about as much out of China as they can expect to, circumstances considered.
It seems like North Korea has been louder lately in terms of trying to toot their own horn and kind of make themselves look threatening. Is there a motivation for that we know of?
Yeah, Trump. Before the North Korean leadership, the government, they would issue threats, what have you, almost always empty threats. And then the American government would say, we support our allies, well, blah, 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 what have you. Just the normal stuff. And that would be the end of it. But then the Trump administration has already established itself as being fairly unpredictable. And then on top of that, Donald Trump issues a lot of hostile, shall we say, statements regarding North Korea. And so the North Korean government, unsurprisingly, retaliates with even more hostile statements of its own. So it's basically just a rhetorical tit for tat.
Yeah.
I don't think it's any more meaningful than that. And it's basically already stopped. You know, the North Korean government said it was considering a strike on Guam, which of course they were never going to do.
Because fuck Guam in particular.
Oh yeah, we're gonna get Guam, guys. So they threatened Guam, and then Trump said something, nuclear holocaust, whatever. And then the North Korean leadership said that they had decided to refrain from striking Guam for the moment. Very generous of them. And that's pretty much been the end of it. You know, it hasn't escalated any further, so I wouldn't read much into it. You know, but Chinese cooperation is more at issue. That's more the open political question. And I don't think that the pressure the Trump administration has brought to bear on China has really been that effective. I think the Chinese are more self-interested in the pressure they brought on North Korea. The Chinese government isn't all that excited about a North Korean nuke any more than anybody else is. You know, they just want North Korea to be a nice, quiet buffer state that keeps the Americans and South Koreans away from their Manchurian border. They don't really need all this extra grief. So as far as that goes, they'll probably keep pressuring North Korea. But, you know, I don't know if even that'll be enough, because for the North Korean government, it's kind of an existential issue. With nuclear weapons, it'll be almost impossible to use any kind of force to threaten them, because the nuclear weapons would be a credible deterrent. You know, even if they're not very powerful nuclear weapons, and they don't even have that many, you know, it doesn't really, it's a credible threat to say that they could use them on a city. Certainly in South Korea, you know, maybe even somewhere else if they could smuggle them out. So that would be a very, very useful tool for the North Korean government, and I think that's the reason they're pushing so hard to get it.
Small nukes and bad nukes are still nukes.
Yeah. Yeah, something that happened a while back, but that I thought hadn't really mentioned until now was the Trump administration and the Republican Party kind of fighting to repeal Obamacare. And that went rather poorly. Yeah, maybe I don't recall if we ever really touched on it over the past couple weeks, but yeah, they tried really hard to push it, and it just didn't work. There wasn't enough agreement. You know, they would change something to appeal to the right wing of the party, and then the left wing would say they wouldn't vote for it. So then they'd change something to appeal to the left wing of the party, and then people on the right would say they wouldn't vote for it. And they never seemed able to find the balance. And I think the most telling thing was when they tried to pass what they called skinny repeal, which was basically a minimal repeal that just repealed the parts of Obamacare that the Republican Party liked the least. That being the universal mandate and I think the Medicaid expansion. Maybe I'm wrong on that, but certainly the universal mandate they wanted to repeal. And so it was a very narrow repeal bill basically that they thought could appeal to everyone, but even that wasn't enough because I think it was the right wing of the party thought it was a cop-out. They said full repeal or nothing, basically, and so they didn't support it, and that was the end of it. Yeah, I think that's the one that John McCain voted on. He voted against it in typical hammy fashion. He kept everybody guessing until the last minute, then he walked into the chamber and gave his famous thumbs down.
Wow,
He's
what a
always-
showman.
Yeah. So that was a shit show. It didn't really speak well of Republican unity, basically, which has been an issue for a while. They've been trying to cover it up by focusing on things they can all agree on, like tax reform and what have you, but where the rubber meets the road, where they actually try to implement policy, there are so many disagreements, it becomes very difficult. And in the case of the Obamacare repeal, it was impossible. And it also didn't really say much for Trump's ability to negotiate to politic, basically. And one of the most difficult jobs for any new president, especially one who's not politically experienced, is learning the ropes in Washington, how you politic, how you get people on your side, how do you persuade people or coerce people. For career politicians, that comes second nature. They know that really well. But for the newer guys, it's really hard. Obama had the same problem. He wasn't a career politician, and he didn't really know how to politic. And as a result, he didn't really get anything done until the later years, and by then he was kind of a lame duck. So Trump is kind of exhibiting the same tendencies. There's ignorance about how you actually do politics in Washington, how you construct legislation, form it, build support for it. You know, that aspect of it is kind of missing there for him. For which I'm sure his critics are grateful.
Yeah.
Oh, one other Trump thing that I thought was humorous was the Taliban actually wrote him a letter. Did you hear about this?
No.
The Taliban in Afghanistan wrote Donald Trump an actual letter, and basically telling him that he should, you know, get the fuck out of Afghanistan. The usual Taliban type stuff.
Oh yeah.
But then I thought it was kind of cute that they threw in this, and I think it's a direct quote. They, done you the biggest favor internationally by rescuing the world from the Red Communist Plague.
Yeah, so
Interesting. Yeah, technically true.
little historical
Little bit.
reminder, just in case Trump hasn't done his own research about what happened there. So for any viewers who don't know about that interaction of why they would say that, what's the TLDR of Afghanistan, Russia, or USSR?
Long story short, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979. Invasion, you could quibble over that, but effectively that's what it was. And so for the next 10 years after that, thereabouts, the Soviets fought a counterinsurgency in Afghanistan, a rebellion of Afghans, mostly conservative Afghans, many of whom were Islamists, who would later on become radical Islamists. Osama bin Laden, fought in Afghanistan against the Soviets, and pretty much everybody and their mother who was an Islamist in the 1980s went to Afghanistan at some point and tried to fight the Soviets. It was a kind of popular hotspot if you were a radical jihadi at that time. And they got lots of money from the United States and China and, you know, a whole bunch of other rivals of the Soviet Union at the time. But by talking here about helping the international community by fighting the Red Communist Plague, that's the Taliban taking credit for that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, long story short, that's what that is. They also threw in kind of an appeal to American politics. They say that in the letter, I quote, "American youth are not to be killed in the deserts and mountains of Afghanistan in order to establish the rid of thieves and corrupt officials," referring there to the Afghan government.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of tapping some of that American war weariness there and trying to appeal to that.
Yeah. You don't want to be losing your youth either.
So I just thought it was a cute little letter by the Taliban to Donald Trump himself.
Yeah.
Probably won't have much effect, but I thought it was interesting they made the attempt.
Mm-hmm.
Not a bad attempt. Tapping American politics, war weariness, criticizing the Afghan government, throwing in a reminder of the 80s. It's not bad. It's better than what they usually do, which is basically to say, you know, great Satan, etc., this, that, and the other. I think somebody did have a question. Let me see. What are the ramifications of Elon Musk calling for a ban on killer robots? Probably not much. Last I checked, Elon Musk was not much of a political authority. And I think there are, you know, implications as far as the potential for killer robots and the damage they could do, but right now it's so far into the future that it probably won't be relevant in the near to medium term, whatever Elon Musk may think about it. Yeah, that's kind of getting into the realm of futurism, and that's not something I know as much about. So if I had to guess, if I had to give you an answer, I would just say there won't be any short to medium term impact. Maybe over the long term, but far as I know, there's no regulatory push to do anything about killer robots, such as they are. Not a great answer, but again, not really my area. There was one thing I wanted to throw in, because I just thought this was funny. There's been a series of scandals in Australia about. Actually, I think I mentioned this last week, didn't I? The Australian dual citizenship scandals.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, there was another one. I think it was the Deputy Prime Minister this past week who was found to have New Zealand citizenship. Just kind of keeps going. I think it's half a dozen politicians now in Australia got caught up in it. Oh, Erdogan was in the news. That was also interesting. There's a whole bunch of Turks in Germany, right? They had a bunch of Turks come into Germany as guest workers in the 1970s.
Yep.
So now there's a very large, substantial population of Turks there in Germany who are left over from that.
Yeah,
and they can vote.
Quite a few Turkish-German viewers of the channel as well, because Germany is one of the main StarCraft countries that views and supports the game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they can vote. And Erdogan told them not to vote for any of the establishment large German political parties in the upcoming elections in Germany. Basically called them enemy parties, I think is what his words were. Which is a pretty bold move. Earlier he was criticizing the German government for not allowing him to campaign in Germany over that presidency, or not presidency, the referendum over whether to turn Turkey into a presidential system. He accused the German government of behaving like Nazis and using Nazi tactics, because they wouldn't let him come there, basically, and campaign for a yes vote in the referendum. So this is kind of a continuation of the fallout, or the falling out in German-Turkic relations, which continues unabated.
Yeah, I would think that Germans wouldn't be very happy about that kind of statement.
No, they haven't been. They're not real gung-ho about it. But I don't know how much difference it'll make, though, because Erdogan, I don't know how much support Erdogan has among German Turks. I think in general, there's a fair amount of support. I think I did read that at one point. But I don't know if that support is continued in light of the events of the past few years, as far as Erdogan continuing to centralize power. So I think that'll be interesting to see how the Turkic community in Germany responds to that. I think it'll say something about the degree of his support amongst the community there.
And there's also the element of how effectively the Turkish Germans have integrated into German society and culture and adopted their norms. Because if they have, then him saying that just seems ridiculous, and it's like, yeah, I'm glad we left.
Yeah. Kind of. There's a fair amount of assimilation, but the Germans have always been a little weird about the Turkic guest worker program. Because for a long time, it was always kind of assumed they would go back to Turkey, even though they'd been there sometimes for 10, 20 years. And that was just how the guest worker program was constructed. And so there was kind of a sense that they were never really quite citizens. Apparently they've gained some degree of citizenship since they can vote now, but my impression was that the Germans always kind of held them at arm's length. We're kind of letting them in to be workers, but it's not a permanent thing. Turned out to be permanent, but at the time, that was the logic anyway. There's actually a debate in Europe about what the best assimilation policy is, as far as taking in immigrants, above and beyond just not taking any. If you do take them in, how do you assimilate them? And Germany, France, and Britain have all taken kind of different approaches to it. In Britain, it was the multicultural approach. We're going to let you come here and you can do your own thing, and you have to just nominally recognize and identify with the British state. And then in Germany, of course, they had the guest worker approach, which is basically to just pretend they weren't there, just kind of let them come and have them off to the side somewhere and just assume they'll leave at some point. And then, of course, the French had the traditionally French model, which is you have to be fucking French. You need to be French. Very proud of their French identity there, so they were strongly assimilationist in France. And all three policies have not really generated the desired result. The manifestation that makes people question the validity of the models is the rise in terrorism. It happens frequently enough that there's a question about the degree to which these populations have been successfully assimilated, ignoring the fact that it's a small minority of the population, the immigrant population, that actually engages in that behavior. Most people probably do assimilate just fine.
Yeah.
But, in France you have the ghettos around Paris and the Paris suburbs and other places. In Britain, there's a similar issue. And I don't know if they have quite the same kind of problem in Germany, where you just have areas, urban areas, where there are chronically poor populations of immigrants who don't entirely identify with the German culture and don't assimilate. I haven't heard as much about that, but again, I don't know as much about the German case. But in the French and British case, they have that problem, and it kind of speaks to the failure of their respective assimilation policies. In contrast, here in the United States, we kind of have a combination of the French and British model. It's just kind of we talk about multiculturalism. We say, yeah, do what you want, be your own culture, but in practice, it's effectively a French model. You should be American.
Speak English, God damn it!
Yeah, that's the thing. It's American liberalism, and I use the classical sense of the word liberalism, American liberalism, has always been kind of a domineering kind of ideology. You can be different, you can have your other culture, just so long as it's not enough to be threatening. You should be sufficiently liberal that you can be American. You can be something else, but just so long as it's not really all that substantive. That's kind of a traditional American form of hypocrisy.
Yeah.
That's a whole nother conversation.
It's freedom with fine print.
Let's see, somebody asked something. Is there a reason why we care so much about our president when the legislative branch holds more weight? Yeah, we actually talked about this last week. It was about the executive branch gaining more and more power. What they call the imperial presidency. Political scientists like to use that term, imperial presidency. Yeah, the power of the executive branch has grown tremendously over the past 30, 40 years. Well, over the past 60 years, actually, but especially over the past 30, 40 years. And so the attention paid to the presidency, even though the legislative branch is still, substantially more powerful when it wants to be, when it wants to exercise the power, is because the executive branch has accumulated so much power. There was a time when the United States sending its military abroad to fight any kind of conflict was a big deal and required a lot of congressional input. But we've reached a point now where the executive branch can just kind of send people out and do whatever with minimal input from Congress. It's almost an afterthought now. That kind of speaks to the degree of power that's held in the presidency now. If the president wanted to, he could just launch a strike against a country. And so long as he could come up with a good enough pretext, he probably wouldn't have any problems. So that's a problem as far as democratic governance goes. That's a whole nother conversation. But that's the reason more attention is paid to the executive branch than the legislature, or than the legislative branch rather. What can and what do nation-states do to defend themselves against bribery or plunder by corporations not constrained by international borders? Kind of depends on the country. Some countries just don't allow corporations much room to operate. Venezuela, for example, and some of the other Chavista governments in South America, they've made it very difficult for foreign investors to come in and operate. And every so often, sometimes even seize their property, although that's another conversation. But anyway, yeah, if you want to protect yourself, there's the cut off trade option. Just don't allow them in. You can have a You can have a well-regulated regime that they have to adhere to when they invest in your country. That's basically what happens in developed countries, rather. There's a strong regulatory state who can oversee them. I imagine the question is more directed at developing countries, so what do they do? Again, some of them don't allow it, others heavily regulate it. A lot of them just allow it kind of freewheel, on the understanding that they'll get a cut, because a lot of governments in the developing world are corrupt, especially in some of the poorer states, and they'll be happy to let corporations come in if it means that they will bribe them. So in that sense, the defense against bribery is to take bribes and lie about it. Yeah, well, that's corruption. That's the nature of it. I mean, saying how do countries defend themselves against bribery and plunder by corporations suggests that countries don't want to be bribed and plundered by corporations. There's good money in that for the governments in question.
That was one of the problems. We enjoy it.
Yeah.
We just enjoy that shit.
Well, that was one of the problems faced by Africa. Africa was colonized and exploited for a long time by Europeans. And then upon independence, a lot of the new leaders of African countries saw a lot of profit in continuing the same exploitation, only with them in the place of the Europeans. And so that was sort of the genesis of a number of corrupt autocratic states in Africa. It's the same sort of exploitative model, but with new management. So in those cases, they don't really mind the bribery so much. We can change the question a little bit. What can countries who do want to protect themselves do? Specifically developing countries. I mean, the answer is always good governance. If you have good governance, if you have good institutions that provide oversight over how the government deals with corporations and in the economic sector, then it's not as much of a problem. Especially if you have a strong democratic political system that subjects the government to the will of the people, the will of the public, then that makes it harder for governments to kind of get away with nefarious activity. Another thing you can do is just to have a laissez-faire economy, then you don't really have to worry about it. There's not as much reason to bribe the government if you can just do whatever you want anyway, so that's another option as well. Yeah, there's no easy answer to that, because there's a big disparity in power and expertise between a lot of governments and corporations. Corporations generally, especially large multinationals, have access to the best and brightest. They can get high-quality talent and conjure immense financial resources. And those are human and financial resources often unavailable to smaller countries, smaller developing countries. So in any negotiation, they're always at a disadvantage. No easy solution to that, unfortunately. What do you think about Poland-USA relations and Polish migrant policy? It's interesting. Polish-American relations are very one-sided. I remember there was a documentary from, God, it must have been 15 years ago, a long time ago. I'm old. But in that documentary, they looked at how people in other nations, well, I shouldn't say other, people outside of America perceive the United States. And one of the people they interviewed was a Polish guy in Poland. And he said that the relationship between America and Poland was like that between a wife and an abusive husband. Poles like America and want to come here, but America, the American government specifically, kind of makes it difficult to get visas, relatively. That was his point anyway. I don't know if that's still true. Again, it's a long time ago. But yeah, I mean, the United States government, and certainly in broader society and the media, I don't think anybody thinks about Poland that much. I think about Poland. I think it's an interesting country, and if you follow European politics, Poland comes up pretty frequently, especially over the past couple years. But most people in the United States, especially just kind of your average American, don't really give a shit about stuff that happens outside of the United States. So in that sense, they don't really care. The American government likes to foster, I'm sure under the Trump administration especially, would like to foster a good relationship with Poland. all the more so because there's a political affinity between the current government in Poland and the Trump administration. In that sense, relations are pretty good. I don't know what action or what policy that will manifest, that will cause to manifest, but in general, I think relations are pretty good. As for Polish migrant policy, I don't know a lot about Polish migrant policy. The only thing I know about Polish migrant policy is that Poland is one of the, I'm probably going to mispronounce it, it's one of the Visegrad countries that are against the European Union's plan to relocate refugees according to a quota system. Because right now, a lot of them are settling in France, Germany, basically in a few countries. And there's a desire to distribute refugees evenly across Europe instead of having them in just a handful of countries. And the Visegrad countries are dead set against it. So I know that much about Polish migrant policy. If you want me to comment on that, I can do that, but I can't really say much beyond as far as anything beyond that because I don't know the specifics of Poland's migrant policy. I mean, as far as the Visegrad group's opposition to redistribution, of refugees, I mean, it's no surprise to me. I mean, Poland and most Central European and East European countries are very ethnically homogenous. And, that's very much on purpose. That was done purposely by the Allies after World War II because of all the trouble that having mixed, for lack of a better word, mixed ethnic populations around Europe seemed to be the genesis of a lot of trouble before and during World War II. So the Allies decided maybe we should just make all of these countries ethnically homogenous. And so a distinctly Polish state was created among, every other states. And as a result, because that was the case for half a century basically, there's not as much familiarity, I think, in Poland with other ethnic groups, and so there's a hostility to the idea of having a lot of people come in, especially, I think, with the Middle East in particular, because that's been politicized now on account of terrorism and suspicion of the European Union and other European political elites. Somebody from Poland would, maybe this person is from Poland, they would probably know better than me the reasons for Polish opposition to immigration, specifically from the Middle East. But politically speaking, it's no shock to me that they oppose redistribution of European refugees. And they'll probably get their way, which is kind of sometimes lost in the European dispute over this. Because the European Union, again, I've said it before, I'll say it again, the European Union is a fundamentally weak organization. It has a great deal of difficulty imposing its will. Generally, when the European Union's will is imposed, it's not really the European Union imposing it, it's the stronger states in the European Union imposing it on its behalf. Germany and France in particular being examples of that. But, Poland, I don't think, can be forced to take refugees, and I don't think they're going to be. So I think if you're concerned about that and you're in Poland, then probably don't have to worry about it too much. So I hope that answers the question sufficiently. If not, you can ask for something more elaborate. That's just what I've got off the top of my head. Yeah, I think I've said it before, so I'll reestablish this. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. Some of this is just stuff I've read about, and not all of it I've even read about a whole lot,
It's a beautiful coincidence my opponent is Polish, right as we're talking about it. Speak of the devil.
So I think it's, we haven't talked about India much since the first week, I think. Mm-hmm. I think it's the 70th anniversary or something like that of India's independence. And the reason I bring it up is because partition was kind of a part of that process. And so there's been a lot of stories about partition in the news. I think you might have maybe you've seen some of the articles I was posting in Facebook over the past week or two. Mm-hmm. There's been a whole bunch of them, and partition is a pretty big deal in South Asia as far as relations between India and Pakistan and the geopolitical situation there. Even though it happened, 70 plus years ago, it's still very relevant. And are you familiar with partition?
Vaguely.
Yeah, so partition was, actually, I think we've talked about it before, so maybe I can jog your memory. Partition was separating British India into Pakistan and India.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, partition refers to that process. And it was kind of a slapdash, haphazard process. The British decided they were going to leave India in 1940, I think, 47, something around there. And when they decided to do it, they decided to do it fast. They decided they were going to leave after like a year, which was a bit fast, considering the size of British India and the complexity of the discussion over what independent India would look like. 1 year is a very small amount of time. And so they started that process, and almost immediately there was a lot of discord in British India, as it was then, between people who wanted a Muslim state, who wanted to carve out a state specifically for Muslim Indians, and then everybody else who either wanted a Hindu India and kind of agreed with them on partition, and then other people who wanted a unified India. Mahatma Gandhi wanted a unified India, and he thought the partition of India was a great tragedy. He called it the vivisection of India. I think Jawaharlal Nehru was kind of more for it. Nehru was a major leader of the Indian National Congress at that time in India's history. And his counterpart on the other side was a guy named Jinnah. I forget his first name. And Jinnah was the great leader, who's the big leader of the, Muslim League, as it was called then. It's changed its name since then, I think. And, the interesting thing about the Muslim League is that they weren't really pushing for a separate state, pushing for Pakistan, basically, until 1940. And even then, it wasn't like a big vote getter. It didn't really become a major attractor. It wasn't really widely supported even in the Muslim community, I think, until the mid-40s, the mid-1940s. And there's kind of an enduring suspicion on the part of people in South Asia, in both Pakistan and India, that the British kind of pushed the Muslim League towards pushing for Pakistan in order to divide India and make it weaker, so they could kind of continue to influence India even after the British left. I don't know enough about Indian history to know if there's any substance to that, but I've heard that a lot. But anyway, partition specifically impacted two particular parts of India. One was Bengal, and the other was Punjab, both of which were kind of wealthy parts of South Asia, or were some of the wealthiest parts of British India. And because they were kind of relatively well off, and also because of historical reasons, they were relatively mixed in terms of religion, kind of a fair balance between Muslims and Hindu, and Sikhs in the case of Punjab, or Sikhs rather. I think it's how it's properly pronounced. Sikhs in the case of Punjab. We could talk about Sikhs sometime. That's an interesting religion. But because Punjab and Bengal were so mixed, the British were faced with a really difficult problem as far as demarcating where the border would be between India and Pakistan. Because in most other provinces, they would just say, okay, the whole province is in Pakistan, or the whole province is in India. But in Punjab and Bengal, they basically had to split them in half. So the exact location of the border became a really important issue, because a lot of people who were either Hindu or Muslim didn't want to be in Pakistan or India, depending on what their religion was. So, if the border was a kilometer west or a kilometer east, that could make a big difference to you. So once the border was established, and even before the border was established, there was already violence basically between groups, because some people thought if you had like a village that had maybe 60% of one religious group and then 40% of the other, maybe there's a chance that you could be put in the wrong country, quote unquote. So like a majority Hindu village might be afraid of ending up in Pakistan, so they might turn on their minority. They might turn on the Muslims in the village in order to have the village be more Hindu, to increase the odds of them being in India, which was not really good logic, as you can imagine. The guy who was actually drawing up the border was a British judge who had never been in India before, and then after he finished drawing the border, never came back. So I don't think he was terribly concerned about such things. So already tensions were really high over partition, and then when it actually happened, when the borders were drawn, there was a huge migration of people. It was one of the largest single migrations in the 20th century, and it happened very quickly. So huge populations of Muslims in India, and then Hindus in Pakistan migrated across the border. And there was an immense amount of violence because, again, there was a lot of enmity generated by partition, especially in Punjab and Bengal. And political radicals on both sides would target the refugees. And there are, just really sad, terrible stories. And, if you read the BBC World News, if you're interested in this, has been running a number of stories about partition and, some of what happened during partition. And a lot of them are really heartbreaking stories. Like there are stories of refugees, fleeing to the other country. They would all get into a train to hop the border, but then the train would get stopped by militiamen, basically radicals, and then everybody on the train would be massacred. And so people in Pakistan or in India would wait to receive refugees from the other country, and then the trains would pull in and they would just be full of dead bodies, just completely jam-packed with them. And it was a lot of people. It was something like, I think, 500,000 to 1 million people died. The number of refugees went up into the, 12 million refugees, I think, was the grand total.
Wow.
And it was an immense movement of people, and it changed the human geography of India, because New Delhi, the capital of India, used to have a very large, prominent Muslim population, because it was the capital of so many Islamic empires in India history. It had a very sizable population there that was very well rooted there, and it had a long history. It was culturally important to the city, and it was a big part of the city's identity. Most of those people actually left New Delhi, and so New Delhi actually lost touch with a big part of its history, losing that population. In turn, a huge number of Hindus living in what became the Pakistani part of Punjab migrated out and ended up settling in New Delhi. So from what I've read anyway, maybe I'm wrong, maybe somebody from India could kind of elaborate on this, but from what I've read, New Delhi ended up being, after partition, much more Punjabi, whereas before it hadn't had hardly any Punjabis in it. So that was a big cultural shakeup there, a big significant change. So a lot of that rivalry between the Muslim League and the Indian National Congress, in general, between India and Pakistan, basically. It predates partition, before they even existed, and then after partition it got even worse because of all the violence that occurred, and it created a lot of lasting hate and mistrust. And then, of course, that was basically institutionalized because of the conflict in Kashmir. So the conflict in Kashmir is, in a way, a continuation of that violence that happened in partition and before partition. It's a kind of communal violence between Indian Muslims and Indian Hindus. Not everybody in India is a Hindu, but the corollary there, the analogy is Kashmir conflict as a continuation of that rivalry between those two groups. So that's kind of the importance of partition in a nutshell.
Nice.
And in so much as that rivalry between India and Pakistan makes Pakistan paranoid in terms of their national security, it's also part of the reason why the United States is in Afghanistan. Because, of course, the Pakistani government doesn't want the Afghan government to really be independent, because they're afraid it'll ally with India, and then they'll have a problem on their western border. We talked a little bit about this before.
Yeah.
But in that way, partition has also impacted the United States, in so much as it helps define the security situation in South Asia, and in so much as that security situation has resulted in an American occupation of Afghanistan and an ongoing conflict there. Somebody asked, what did India have that Britain wanted? That's actually a deceptively complex question. So the history of British colonialism in India actually starts kind of mild, because Britain was one of a number of countries that traveled to. It wasn't even countries; it was companies. I should make that clear. It was not countries that originally came to India and started trade with India, between India and Europe. It was trading companies, like the East India Company or the Dutch East India Company or their equivalents in other countries. You know, even Denmark had a trading company for a while. So there was a whole bunch of trading companies that all went to India to try and monopolize the trade in spices, which were kind of the big ticket item back in the 1600s. Well, actually, even back in the 1500s when the Portuguese were actually the first to get to India, and they were basically pirates. They didn't exactly set a great first impression for Europeans in South Asia. Yeah, they stole a lot, pirated a lot, and were generally violent assholes. But they were only there for 100 years or so before the other European countries came and started trading and started competing with them for that Indian trade. So what they wanted at first was just anything that could be traded in Europe at a good price. Anything that was rare in Europe. Things like spices, things like fancy clothing, or even just regular clothing. You know, it was relatively cheap in India at that time. And those were kind of the two big things. And so India attracted the India companies on that account. But at first, they weren't interested in domination. They were just interested in making money. They would come to a port, and they would basically just trade at first. As they made more money, they started bribing the people who ran the ports in order to give them trade advantages over their competitors, not just other Europeans, but also sort of Indian competitors. And once they became powerful enough, they eventually were able to buy from the local governments the right to run the ports themselves. And the reason they were able to do that, unlike some of the local Indian traders, is that European companies had the advantage of European capital. There was not really, as far as I know, any equivalent to European stock markets, which were emerging in the 1600s at that time, in which you could gather the combined savings and capital of a large number of people into a single project. So through the stock market and investing, East India companies, rather, were able to conjure up an immense amount of operating capital that could not be matched by smaller competitors in other places. It took a while for that to happen. That kind of, the rise of East India companies as political players in India, beyond just economic players, took about 150 years. It was a slow burn. It happened kind of over time. By the time you get to the mid-1700s, that's when you really start European powers, European companies, playing a political role in India. They would basically support one faction or the other in a civil war or in a conflict in exchange for privileges, economic privileges specifically. And that was the genesis of their rise in power in India. From there, they started actually controlling territory, and eventually Britain basically monopolized all of India. That's kind of another conversation, though. The question is, what are they interested in? Originally, they were interested just in trade, specifically spices and other goods. Eventually, the Dutch ended up getting the spices because the Dutch actually went beyond India and found the Spice Islands, where most of the spices, things like nutmeg, were actually grown. And at that time, they weren't really grown anywhere else. You know, those islands were like the single big producer. And the Dutch sought them out. This is how the Dutch ended up in Indonesia, by the way. They went to the Spice Islands and conquered them and monopolized their trade. And because spices were the higher profit item, there were higher profit margins. the Dutch kind of won the trade war in that sense because they got the good that everybody was really after. But it ended up being a kind of empty victory, a Pyrrhic victory for them. Because over time, other traders started stealing the seeds for a lot of these spices, for the plants that produce the spices, and started growing them in other places. So over time, the value of those spices went down as other producers emerged to compete down the price. The British, in contrast, ended up with a much stronger position in India, and that ended up being better for them because they were able to monopolize the trade in cloth. And cloth was not a high profit margin trade. So for a long time, it seemed like they ended up with kind of the consolation prize. But it actually ended up being a big advantage for them because while it's a low profit margin trade, it's a consistent trade. It's a high volume trade. If you trade a lot of clothes, you can end up with a lot of profits. And one of the things European traders did after they became dominant in East Asia, in the Asian trade realm, is they started dominating the carry trade. Right, so they weren't just dominating the trade between India or Indonesia or wherever and Europe. They started dominating the trade between Asian countries, between India and Indonesia, between India and China. Previously, Europeans had focused just on the European trade, and the trade between Asian kingdoms and countries was done by Asian traders. But the Europeans realized they could make a lot more money if they started dominating the intra-Asian trade as well. And that ended up generating a lot of the currency they needed to continue buying goods from places like China, specifically China, because the Chinese didn't really want European goods. The Europeans didn't really have anything they could trade to get Chinese tea and other things from China they wanted. And so dominating the carry trade, such as it was, kind of gave them the money they needed for that. I guess I should explain what carry trade means. Carry trade is just the money you make from transporting goods. So, somebody wants to move goods from one place to the other. The carry trade is basically the trade in ships that carry those goods. The guy who owns the ship gets a fee for transportation. So that's the carry trade. Yeah, exactly. So Europeans dominated the carry trade in, I want to say, the 1700s. Don't quote me on that. I'm not an economic historian, but I think that's accurate. And so that allowed them to also get a lot of tea from China, clothes from India, and then eventually start growing tea in India as well. That's what Darjeeling in India is famous for. Yeah, that was something the British imported into Darjeeling and started growing there, I think, if I'm remembering this correctly. But anyway, this is kind of a long-winded answer. I'll try to sum it up. Basically, what they were interested in was spices and clothes, and more broadly, trade and profits. The fact that they ended up controlling India directly, politically speaking, is a lot of that is due to that same drive for profits. Because the East India Company realized that they could make a lot of money if they had the power to tax. And that's actually, before they controlled any territory, they had actually gotten the right to collect taxes for the Mughal Empire in Bengal, which was kind of their power base in the mid-1700s. The East India Company's power base, rather. And, they would give most of the tax revenue over to the Mughal Emperor, but they would also get a cut of that, and that boosted their profits. It's basically just free money. After a while, the East India Company got sufficiently powerful that the Nawab of Bengal, basically the king of Bengal, who was a sort of servant of the Mughal Emperor nominally, had a lot of autonomy by that point. The Mughal Empire was very much in decline by the mid-1700s. But anyway, both Bengal and the Mughal Empire were both became increasingly skeptical of the power wielded by the East India Company in India, in South Asia generally. And eventually they just decided to eject them from their power base in Bengal, and that precipitated a war that was actually a part of the larger 7 Years' War. I think it happened in 1763, thereabouts. Early 1760s anyway. And there was a huge battle between the company's military, because, they had an army, to protect their trading. It was normal for European trading companies to have a military arm, because other trading companies would regularly raid each other. So you needed protection, and you couldn't depend on the local kingdoms to provide it. So they raised an army. beyond the normal army they had to protect their trading interests, to fight the Mughal Empire and the army of the Nawab of Bengal. And the armies they faced were actually way larger than theirs. The advantage they had was in technology and having European officers who were trained in modern warfare. And of course, there's that ever-present secret European weapon, which is to just bribe people not to fight them. A good chunk of the Indian army that they were facing ended up leaving, much to the surprise of the Mughal Emperor, because the British had actually bribed them before the battle started not to fight them. There are big advantages. Again, going back to that advantage of having a stock market and being able to have access to large financial resources. One of the advantages to having a lot of money to throw around is that you can just bribe people. If you get into a fight, you can just say, I want to fight you, have some money, get the fuck out of my face. That's basically how the British won that battle. And that battle solidified, well, it started British actual territorial control in Bengal. That was how that political control got started. And then later on, there was another battle, and I don't remember what that was. I think maybe the Battle of Buxar. That was the battle where their control became official. It was kind of a follow-up battle a year or two later. And that's how the British got territorial control. So, in a way, it was almost by accident. They weren't really seeking territorial control. They were kind of defending themselves, and when they won, one of the things they extracted from the peace was territorial control, which they could use to tax the population for their own profits. And once it became apparent that was a viable source of revenue, a viable source of growth, they started expanding, conquering other territories to generate growth that would, well, return value to their stockholders, shareholders, basically. So the expansion of British power, the point I'm trying to make is that the expansion of British territorial control in India is part and parcel of that drive for profits, which is what the British were really interested in India. So that's kind of the short answer to the question. How did India become part Muslim, half Hindu? Was it separate countries pre-Britain? India was a whole shit ton of countries pre-Britain. It was there was a time when the Mughal Empire spanned a good chunk of South Asia, but they never were able to conquer the southern part of India. And the parts of southern India they did conquer, they hadn't held for very long before those parts broke off and basically became independent kingdoms. So there was a whole, Indian history is replete with the different Indian kingdoms. I mean, don't think of India as like one whole. Think of it almost like Europe. In Europe there's all these different ethnicities and countries. India is similar in that regard. It's geographically smaller than Europe, but it has a lot of the same degree of diversity, if not more. In fact, it probably does have a lot more diversity, ethnically speaking, than Europe. So it's immensely diverse in terms of ethnic groups, and historically speaking, diverse in terms of kingdoms and centers of political control. How did India become part Muslim and part Hindu? Hinduism has a long history, so they've just kind of always been Hindu. Maybe I should specify that Hinduism is not quite a religion like Westerners think of it. Hinduism is almost just more Indian culture. It's more India's cultural norms and traditions, above and beyond like an organized monotheistic religion like Europeans or Middle Easterners might think of it. So Hinduism has always been there. Islam was introduced in, I think around 1200 AD. That was when the Central Asian horse peoples basically invaded northwestern India, or should I say South Asia, and that was the initial introduction. Well, no, that's not quite true either, actually. During the Islamic expansion, way back when Islam originally got started, around 700 AD, there actually was a successful invasion of what is now the Punjab, basically the Indus River, specifically the southern part of the Indus River. That was as far as they got, but that actually was probably the first instance of Islam in South Asia. And then later on in 1200, there was a big invasion of Central Asians into India that really established Islamic control over broad swaths of northern India. And I would be remiss if I did not also point out that there were a number of Islamic traders who introduced Islam to southern India. There's a lot of differences between North India and South India. So South India's experience with Islam is a lot more peaceful. It's just Muslim traders would travel to South India rather, and introduced it, and it kind of got a footing there on that account. And I think to this day, the state of Kerala in India has something like 20% of its population as Muslim, which I think is the only substantial Islamic population outside of North India, the only substantial Islamic population in South India. So that was the introduction of Islam to India. And over the course of centuries, most of pretty much all of Sindhi in sort of the southern Indus River was converted. A good chunk of Punjab was converted. And then somehow Bengal ended up getting converted. I asked a professor when I was in graduate school about that, and there's not really like a solid answer. It's not quite a mystery. Basically, proselytizers came there and proselytized the population, but the big question amongst anthropologists is why Bengal ended up with so many Muslims, but not any other area around it. It's just kind of an isolated pocket of Islam, surrounded by the Hindu heartland in northern India, and then Burma to the east, and then Himalayas to the north. It's just kind of a weird thing in history. It's an interesting subject to talk about. But anyway, however the hell that happened, most of Islam in South Asia can be traced to either traders coming to southern India, or to the Central Asian invasions in 1200 AD. And again, there were varying degrees of conversion. The middle part of northern India, that Gangetic Plain, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, that's kind of always been the Hindu heartland. So Islam was less successful, relatively speaking, at converting that population. Most of the converts, from what I've read, not an expert, from what I've read, most of Islam's converts in India during that period were in cities, because those were the administrative centers, and so that was where the control of the Islamic leadership was most able to exercise its power. And kind of going back to what I was talking about New Delhi, that's why New Delhi ended up with a strong Islamic presence. That was a major administrative center for not just the Mughal Empire, but a number of Islamic kingdoms from 1200 up until partition, basically. I don't think I would say India became half Muslim. I think that's a stretch. I think Islam was always a minority in India. Not in every part of South Asia, but I don't think they had the bulk of South Asia's population, even now. If you combine the populations of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh today, I think only something like a third of the combined population would be Muslim. So they are a minority, a large minority, but they've always been a minority. The push for a separate Islamic state, Pakistan, in the mid-20th century in India, that's something I'd like to read more about, so I can say something more substantive about it. But some of that came out of communal tensions that popped up when people were discussing what independent India would look like. Because again, India has so many different ethnic groups and so many different forms of tension. There's caste tension between Dalits, the lowest caste, and the other people in other castes. There's ethnic tension between different ethnic groups. There's regional tension between North and South. The tension between Hindus and Muslims is just one of many tensions that existed in India at that time. And all of those different groups were all negotiating with each other about what their roles and powers would be in a prospective independent India. And as it happened, the tensions between other groups ended up being sorted out to a degree, not always to everybody's satisfaction, but sufficiently. But the divide between the Muslim League and the INC, the Indian National Congress, ended up being unbridgeable. That's my current understanding of it, but maybe there's more to it than that. There's probably more to it than that. But my current understanding is that the divide there was too great. And the British, for their part, just figured, okay, that's not going to work, so let's just give them their own state. Because otherwise they'll just endlessly fight each other and there'll never be any stability in India. Ended up being regional instability as a result because of the dispute with Kashmir, but they didn't know that was going to happen at that time. So that's kind of a rough answer to that question. What have been the current economic, political effects of the current trend of states legalizing marijuana? And what do you think the long-term effects this will have on trade policy? I haven't studied the marijuana legalization issue all that much, principally because it doesn't interest me that much, so I don't have a whole lot to say on that. The principal economic argument I've heard about legalization is that it generates tax revenue, which I don't think is a particularly great reason to legalize something, but that aside, yeah, from what I've read, it has generated a lot of tax revenue. It has been very successful in that regard. And as far as the long-term effects on policy, I mean, the overarching effects on trade or trade policy probably would be negligible. I don't think there's going to be like a national level legalization for a while. A good long while, probably. Probably the best you could hope for there is weak enforcement. That's kind of what happened with the Obama administration. They weren't really that interested in prosecuting people who were brought up on charges of possession of marijuana. On the other hand, on the state level, there's probably a lot more room for growth there. There's no shortage of states that would love to have some extra tax revenue, so in that sense, probably you'll see more legalizations happen. But again, not quite my area, so I don't have a whole lot to add that's substantive there. You know? Yeah, it's just what I have. I do know that there has been the growth in the marijuana industry. I guess that could, yeah, that's more specific to the question. Current political economic effects. I don't know about political effects so much. Probably not much there, because I don't know how much people's minds have been changed about it one way or the other. But in terms of economic effects, I guess I could say the principal economic effect has been the emergence of a legal marijuana industry. Again, I don't know a whole lot about that, but that's a better answer to the question. The growth of the marijuana industry has probably been the principal economic effect.
So, just to give a reference, since I visited Washington and Oregon on vacation, you could say, spread of dispensaries that you can go and purchase that type of substance are about as common as Starbucks in most places in the US. So, for those of you who don't know about Starbucks, it's all over the place, and oftentimes you'll have one that's across the street from another one. It's just huge numbers of them. The demand is high, the supply is pretty high as well in most cases. I think we talked a little bit last week about Nevada running out because the alcohol industry put a lot of heavy regulations on how easily you could move marijuana from place to place, and it was very difficult. So even though it's fairly easy to grow some, if you're not allowed to move it from place to place, then you can potentially run out.
Huh. That's pretty interesting.
Yeah. It's a lot more strict in terms of checking your age, ID, all this other stuff than just purchasing alcohol. Alcohol, you just walk in and show your ID at the checkout. For those, oftentimes they'll have two separate rooms where you have to go through an area where they screen you and make sure you're not going to raid them, or you're not underage and that sort of thing, and then they'll let you in and see what their products are. Whereas alcohol's been around for so long that they kind of know sometimes people just go in, they get their stuff, and it's basically fine. I think it's partially because those companies and places want to cover their ass in terms of not getting into too much trouble, because it's already kind of thin ice. Because the federal level, they could potentially punish people who are selling weed in that capacity, but they're not, so...
Yeah, Jeff Sessions probably has them a little bit concerned. Current Attorney General is a old drug warrior from back in the 80s. But he might get fired soon, so maybe not a problem.
Who knows?
Who knows? Who knows with the Trump administration? I guess you could say that another... well, the long-term impact of this, specifically on legalization, I don't think there's much of a long-term effect there, because the legalization itself is the effect. It's the effect of a change in public mood. More people are more willing to accept legalization of marijuana now than before. So, as a result of that, the effect has been legalization. So, I think politically speaking, it would be more productive to look at that aspect of it, if you're interested in that as a topic. Tracking the shift in public mood and where that's happening and amongst what groups. I imagine probably younger people are more for it.
Yeah. Well,
probably.
The war on drugs isn't really something I know a whole lot about, but what do you know about that? Because that's fairly recent in the history of the United States and when that became a priority.
Yeah, a lot of that has to do with the 60s culture wars. And, if anybody here is not from America or is unfamiliar with American politics in the 1960s, I highly recommend it as a subject because it's very interesting. But the 1960s was a very turbulent period of American history. And there was an immense outpouring of political dissent, especially amongst younger people. So it's kind of the emergence of hippies and the new left and what was called then the counterculture. And a lot of those younger people, baby boomers basically, challenged established social norms as well as political norms, if not also economic norms. And one of the things they did that really challenged the established norms was to experiment with drug use. And that became a part of that generation's identity. So a lot of people, even people in that group actually, conservative baby boomers, and then of course the older folks, who were generally had much more conservative views about drug use, passed a number of laws regarding drug consumption, including marijuana, not so much in order to control drug use, but more to try to control the population, to kind of suppress that dissenting political sentiment being expressed by the counterculture. So it was almost more of a political move than a health move, a health policy move. And those policies have remained on the books ever since. And I think part of the reason is that the culture war that produced those laws has never abated. It's continued basically since the 1960s without a break. And since the baby boomers are kind of nearing the age where they're kind of passing, so to speak, those laws in turn, well, the culture war is kind of ebbing a bit, at least in the 60s frame of mind. But also the drug war laws are also kind of becoming less relevant to the modern demographics. Modern people basically under the age of 40. In that sense, the drug laws are kind of on their last legs. They're probably going to go in the next 10, 20 years, or at least be substantially reformed. But anyway, there's
a good piece of info in the chat on why they have that extra layer of security for dispensaries right now. And that's because they carry a lot of cash, and many of them only deal in cash because banks won't deal with them yet. So they're a really big robbery target.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point.
Cash only type of business. It feels kind of old school.
Well, I mean, that's how you do it on the black market. which is
Yeah.
kind of what it's more gray market in the case of these companies. But
Mhm.
you know, whether you're gray market or black market, you generally work mostly in cash so that you can't be tracked.
Mhm.
So it makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Neat fact.
Mhm.
What could bring lasting peace between modern India and Pakistan? Well, that's easy. Kashmir. If the Kashmir issue could be settled, that would be a huge step forward. It wouldn't, you know, bring peace overnight, but you know, the principal reason for tension between India and Pakistan is Kashmir. And you know, if not for that, there wouldn't be much reason to consider each other rivals. Although I'm sure the Pakistani military could come up with something. Paranoid as it is. That's a whole other conversation we could have. The Pakistani military as an institution and the role it's played in Pakistani history. But beyond that, yeah, the biggest step forward would be Kashmir. And maybe some background info would be useful there. In British India, most of India at that time was controlled directly by the company, or by the British Raj, as it became later. But there was also a good chunk of the territory that was controlled by Indian princes, and these were called princely states. So instead of being directly controlled by the British, these were controlled by native Indian rulers. And you know, the British allowed them to continue to rule their territory in exchange for basically a pledge of loyalty. Most of these kingdoms were very small. A few of them were immensely wealthy. The Nizam of Hyderabad was probably, I think, the largest princely state in British India. And the Nizam himself, the guy who ruled the Nizam of Hyderabad, he himself, I think, was one of the richest men in the world at that time, in the early mid-20th century. So princely states kind of presented a unique problem, because nominally they're autonomous, independent states. They just operated within the rubric of the British Empire and British India. So if India becomes an independent state, as was being discussed in the 1920s, 1930s, what do you do with the princely states? Do you just wrap them into an independent India and they continue to have autonomous status? Or do you strip the kings of their power, or what? How does that work? And so the agreement that was made was that the partition border would decide, you know, which territories were in Pakistan or India, but the princely states were excepted from that rule. They were given an exception. The princely states would have the option of either joining India, joining Pakistan, or becoming independent states. And so they were given that special status as a result. And Kashmir was one such princely state. And Kashmir at that time had a majority Muslim population, and I think it was not a huge majority, it was like 60%, I think. And but the leader, the king of that princely state, was actually a Hindu ruler. And I think, if I remember correctly, that his original decision was actually to become independent, I think. Or maybe he was still in the process of deciding. And then the Pakistanis kind of decided for him. They raised an army of Pashtun militiamen, I believe it was. And nominally, these were volunteers who were fighting to liberate Kashmir. Not at all connected with the Pakistani government or military. Totally were, but the Pakistani government denied it, and I think they still deny it. They set this quote-unquote volunteer army on Kashmir, and then the Kashmiri king asked India for help. And the Indian government, which is actually surprisingly Machiavellian, I had a friend from Pakistan tell me once that the Indian government is kind of seen as being benevolent and good, but it's not really a deserved reputation. They can be quite sneaky when they want to be. The Indian government said they would come to the Kashmiri king's help, come to his aid, but only if he agreed to accede to become part of India, or rather to accede to Kashmir becoming part of India. He wasn't in a position to say no, so he made that agreement. So the Indian military moved into Kashmir and expelled, or at least fought to a draw, the Pakistani forces. And that led to a stalemate, which resulted in the division of Kashmir basically in two, with the western and northern part of Kashmir being part of Pakistan, technically. There's another weird layer of bureaucracy there. And then the other half being Indian, being a part of India. The reason I say weird bureaucracy is because Pakistan never technically annexed the part of Kashmir that it controlled. It's actually technically an independent state called Azad Kashmir, Free Kashmir. And, you know, effectively it's part of Pakistan. You know, they can move into Pakistan. People there in Azad Kashmir can move freely, I think, into Pakistan. And the Pakistani government has nominal control over certain administrative functions. But technically, officially, I think it's supposed to be an independent country. Not really fooling anybody there, but that's the pretense they continue to propagate. The other part of Kashmir is a state in India. It was officially annexed. So the genesis of that Kashmiri conflict stems from that decision regarding princely states. And there's never really been any ability on the part of India or Pakistan to agree on how to resolve that issue. Some people have said maybe just give Kashmir independence and then it's not part of either India or Pakistan. That's not acceptable to either government, it seems. They're not willing to entertain that. The Pakistanis, for their part, have always been of the mind that because it's a Muslim-majority state, country, state, whatever you want to call it, that it should be part of Pakistan. The Indians, for their part, they would argue that, well, the king of Kashmir said that Kashmir would be a part of India, and so that's set in stone. Kind of an undercurrent in Indian thinking, or rather thinking in India, is that Kashmir is sort of the source, or one of the sources anyway, for the Ganga River, which is a holy river in Hinduism. And so the headwaters have kind of a special place in Hinduism. And so there's kind of a religious sentiment to keep Kashmir as part of India, above and beyond whatever the population there may think. The situation was further complicated in the 1990, I think, insurrection. Because Kashmir was relatively quiet for a while after the 1948 war between India and Pakistan over Kashmir. The actual population in Kashmir, I think, was kind of ambivalent for a while. But then in 1990, people got antsy and they actually launched a rebellion. Indians will tell you that rebellion was actually propagated by the Pakistanis, that they were actually Pakistanis from Pakistani-occupied Kashmir that were infiltrated into Indian-held Kashmir to start a quote-unquote rebellion. You know, regardless of which side is more right, probably somewhere in between. The truth is probably somewhere in between. But that rebellion ended up causing a lot of violence in Kashmir that actually drove out a good chunk of the province's Hindu population. Because again, Hindus had been, I think, something like 30-40% of the population. A good chunk of them were driven out by the ensuing violence in that rebellion. Eventually, the Indian government was able to suppress it, but one of the ways they did that was by just flooding troops into Kashmir. And to this day, there's something like there's just a ridiculously huge contingent of the Indian Army in Kashmir. There are probably more Indian troops in Kashmir now than there are Kashmiris in the largest Kashmiri city, easily. And part of the law that the Indian government passed to facilitate that was I don't even remember what it was called. It was basically a national security legislation that gave the Indian military special rights, basically emergency powers in Kashmir. And the Indian Army has used and exercised those emergency powers since 1990. And there are a lot of stories about some soldiers abusing that power. And, the degree to which that's true is debatable, but there's sufficient enmity amongst the native Kashmiri population because of what abuses have occurred, that there's a lot more popular support amongst Kashmiris in Indian-held Kashmir for separation from India than there was before, probably even in 1990. So a lot of the trouble, there's actually a lot of unrest in Kashmir right now. There's been a large degree of protests against the military and Indian rule over the past year or two. And a lot of that is indigenous. So in 1990, it's debatable the degree to which it was indigenous. You know, the Pakistanis probably played a large role in that, but the more recent unrest is probably more indigenous to Kashmir. And a lot of that stems from the emergency powers exercised by the Indian military. So whatever peace agreement comes about regarding Kashmir, it has to also kind of appeal to the people of Kashmir. It has to give them, take into consideration what they want. Because a lot of them don't even necessarily want to be a part of Pakistan. There's a lot of people in Kashmir that just want to be independent, or at the very least to the end of the Indian military's emergency powers. You know, but any peace agreement has to take their consideration into account. But again, that's kind of that's another long meandering answer. The original question was just how do you bring peace between India and Pakistan? However it starts, or whatever peace agreement they end up with, it has to start with Kashmir. That's the principal reason for distrust between India and Pakistan. And if that can be solved, that would probably lead to an inevitable peace agreement of some kind over the long term.
They could just let the Kurds have it and just be like, whatever.
Yeah, just give it to the Kurds.
They want a place. We can't decide which one of us has it, so you can just have it. Nobody gets it.
Nobody gets it. Yeah, that actually reminds me. I don't generally read the chat while we're talking, but I do go back and read it afterwards. The video, because you put the videos up on Twitch, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think somebody was saying that I was skeptical because somebody asked about an independent Kurdish state. That's kind of the new cryptocurrency question. We've been getting those pretty frequently now. And I was skeptical, and I remain skeptical about the efficacy of an independent Kurdish state.
Mm-hmm.
But somebody posted that I was suggesting that it was slapdash, that it hadn't been in planning for a while, that it just wasn't viable at all. I wasn't saying that an independent Kurdish state is not viable in the sense that they couldn't run a government. They've basically already got a government. So in that sense, it's perfectly efficacious for the Kurds to have their own government, just from an institutional perspective. But my criticism comes from the international sphere. I don't think their neighbors would allow them to function. They would probably be invaded outright on day one. And if they weren't invaded outright on day one, then they would be undermined from day one by any and all means that their neighboring states could contrive. I think that same person also brought up Israel as a corollary. Why wouldn't the United States want another ally in the Middle East? Kurdistan could be the next Israel. I don't think Israel is a great example, though, because I don't think that's an example the United States wants to repeat. You know, however strong the ties between Israel and the United States may be, the diplomatic capital the United States has had to burn on behalf of Israel for the past half century has been immense. And I don't think the United States wants to replicate the experience with another country in the Middle East that requires that is utterly dependent on their support. So I don't think Washington is going to be interested in that regard. So some elaboration there on the Kurdish question. Oh, somebody had a question about, okay, yeah. Regarding India, wasn't it just regarding the British desire to be in India and conquer India, etc. This person asks, wasn't it just trading, but also the ideology, was it not just, beyond just trading, was it not also the ideology of having the burden to educate the people by spreading their own language and culture? I'm glad he asked that question, because I can elaborate on something. The British, this is kind of white man's burden, if you're not familiar with this. There was a strong desire on the part of Europeans during a particular era of European empire to proselytize Christianity and democratic institutions amongst the territories that they colonized. And that was considered a civilizing mission. And it was part of the justification used for continuing European rule over different countries, India, Africa, Southeast Asia, etc. Here's the thing, that was part of the motivation for Britain being in India. but it wasn't the original motivation. It didn't really crop up until much later. Basically, it kind of came up around mid 19th century, rather. Before that, the interest was mostly commercial. In fact, technically, the British government did not directly rule India until after the Sepoy Revolt in the 1860s. Before that, India had been controlled by the East India Company, and like in any company, the East Indian Company was only interested really in profits. They had some desire to proselytize the population, but most of that was relegated to creating a bureaucratic caste of, or rather bureaucratic class of Anglo-Indians who could serve in their bureaucratic institutions. And that was kind of the limit of their reform effort. The company itself didn't really want to trample on Indian culture too much because they were afraid that would cause a revolt, which of course would have a very negative impact on profits. The British government didn't give a shit about profits, and after the Sepoy Revolt, they took that as an opportunity to get in and strip the company of its power so that they could rule India the quote-unquote right way, which for them meant really pushing hard on Christianity. And it wasn't even until later that, it wasn't until that point of demarcation that British people in India started really setting themselves apart from the Indians. It used to be that British people in India would mix a lot with the Indian population. In fact, in the 16 and 1700s, there was a great deal of intermixing between British traders and the local Indian population. It didn't really bother them that much. It wasn't a big deal to them. And you could even see that up until even into the early 1800s, when there was a lot of intermixing. A lot of the European chauvinism that emerged and that people remember European empire by, that existed before, obviously, to varying degrees, but it really exploded in the mid-19th century. That was in part because of a religious revival in Europe that really saw Christianity as the cornerstone of European civilization, and that if Europe was going to go out into the world, that it should spread that civilization in order to uplift people, in order to give them the civilization that they benefited from. That was their perspective.
Jesus, take the wheel of our civil institutions.
Yeah, exactly. And so that was a driving impetus for governance in a lot of colonies around the world. But even then, it wasn't really a motivation per se, because it was more of a rationale. It was more of a justification for economic exploitation. Because I'm not saying that there was not an earnest opinion on the part of Europeans that Christianity was good, and that by spreading Christianity, they were helping people. Probably most Europeans believed that earnestly. But that said, it was the economic exploitation that the apparatus of colonialism was mostly interested in. And if they had to use the sort of Christian argument to justify it back home in Europe in order to continue the legitimacy of colonialism, imperialists were quite happy to do that, and they did, and it worked for them and continued European empire for another 100 years. But white man's burden was a motivation for basically social reformers. But for the actual people involved in the economic exploitation of these regions, I think for them it was more of a political tool in order to get people in Europe to continue to allow them to be colonizers. Because a lot of people in Europe, and starting in the mid-late 19th century, got a little cagey about imperialism. If you're a working man in Europe, you don't necessarily benefit that much from imperialism. Not nearly as much as the economic elites in Europe. And so there was kind of a growing skepticism, especially among socialists, socialism being a growing movement at that time. There was a growing skepticism amongst groups like that imperialism was a net good, certainly a moral good. And they turned on it over time. And so imperialists tried to kind of use that religious revival to give them more political support. We're not just here to exploit the locals, we're here to give them civilization. The economic exploitation is just an unfortunate side effect of that. That was their argument. Very self-serving argument, but it worked for a while. So, yeah, white man's burden and proselytizing, etc. That was part of it, but I don't think it was as important as the economic side of it. And maybe that betrays the economic determinist in me. I have a background with economics, so maybe that's my own bias. as far as that goes. But that's my understanding of it. So maybe now would be a good time to talk about some of those corrections we mentioned last week.
Sure.
I think So I talked a little bit about Thailand developing its own judicial system. It's, I guess, more than a month ago now. And I was kind of describing it as, the way they did it kind of acted as a useful tool to preclude concessions, China-style concessions in Thailand, if not outright colonization. But I wanted to specify that that was not the reason Thailand developed their judicial system. The Thai king and Thai government, on their own initiative, started developing the Thai judicial system and institutions of government. It wasn't something they did for Europeans or because of Europeans. It was a specifically indigenous Thai development. The fact that it helped prevent colonization or concessions was a nice side effect, which was the original point I had been trying to make back when we were talking about this. So, little clarification there.
And now we are at peace with the world. Sort of.
Sort of, yeah. We were talking about Temer in Brazil. I'm probably still pronouncing it wrong. President Temer in Brazil. I said before that he had been part of the same party as Rousseff. They were all kind of together. That's not quite accurate. They were in the same coalition. Different parties, same ruling coalition.
Mm-hmm.
So the original point was that I wasn't surprised, or rather that it was a little surprising that Temer turned on Rousseff, given that they were in the same party. Well, still surprising given that they're in the same coalition, but maybe not as surprising given that it's different parties.
Kind of surprising, but not really, but kind of.
Kind of, a little bit.
So Kukio's brother was actually saying that he's been watching the YouTube upload of these talks quite a lot, and
cool.
remembered a few conversations with you about the Vietnam War and the LA riots and kind of the big story there of what's been going on.
The Vietnam War and the LA riots?
I think so. Maybe it was just like you're talking about the culture wars in that sort of period between the left and right. Should we intervene? Should we not? Like you called the new left.
Oh man. Yeah, I don't think I can remember the conversation we had. At least not that specific element of it.
Mm-hmm.
LA. Oh, the 60s. Okay, for whatever reason you said LA riots, and I immediately thought 1991. What does the Rodney King beating have to do with Vietnam? I couldn't make the connection. Yeah, there was the 1960s. Kind of like what I already was talking about. It was an immensely tumultuous period in American history, and part of that was the anti-war movement. And then the other side of it was the civil rights movement and the fallout thereof. And, there was so much enmity between African American communities in places like Detroit and LA and other cities where they'd kind of been forced into ghettos because of de facto housing policies. Yeah, don't let anybody tell you Northerners are less racist than Southerners. It's not really true. A little bit of Yankee hypocrisy there. But yeah, there was African American communities in ghettos like LA, Detroit, etc. They were feeling the repression severely. It was kind of brought out by the civil rights movement. And so eventually they kind of got tired of waiting for equal rights and they started rioting. And so I think there's even a movie coming out recently. I saw trailers for it, like the Detroit riots, something to do with the Detroit riots in the 1960s. So that was a very rough period. for the United States because whole sections of cities would go up in flame in these riots. They were very substantial race riots. Nothing that you can't really find anything comparable today. The closest you could come is that 1991 LA riot after the Rodney King beating. That's the only major riot in the United States for the past couple decades that even comes close to the 1960s race riots. And then the anti-war movement also exacerbated political tensions. The anti-war movement was a broad movement. It was a coalition. It wasn't just hippies, basically. There was also a number of people who would be considered social conservatives now, who were also against it.
Yeah, well, we see that within the Republican Party. Libertarian candidates are very isolationist. We should not be over there. Not because we think war is bad, but because war is expensive and we don't want to spend money on that.
Yeah, that's part of it. But also, people who are very religious, for example, who did not see the purpose in the violence in Vietnam, and thought it was needlessly violent, and wanted for their own ethical religious considerations. According to those beliefs, they opposed it on moral grounds, and that ties into the sort of isolationist tendency in American politics, which continued to exist in that period. That was one of its manifestations. It's been suppressed for a long time. It is kind of having its day in the sun over the past 10 years with the arrival of the populist movement in the United States and Trump administration in particular. But the anti-war movement was kind of a broad coalition of different people who were against the Vietnam War for different reasons. It was not just hippies by any stretch. And that movement created a lot of political enmity as well. That movement created a big divide between people who were anti-war and then, of course, conservatives, almost always conservatives, who were very pro-war. There was also, I should be fair, there was also a lot of Democrats that were pro-war as well. Basically, the nationalist wing of both parties was very pro-war. And
the U.S., we kick ass. We should do more war because we're good at it.
Yeah, well, the divide there has been lasting, like above and beyond anything created by the enmity of the civil rights movement. That divide between the anti-war movement and the pro-war people, you can see that today. Like, I have family who fought in Vietnam, and to this day, that anti-war partisanship, that political divide, still has an impact on his political beliefs. So that was a big defining moment for the baby boomers as a generation. And it still kind of partly defines them. A lot of culture wars in the United States today are kind of relitigations of the 1960s culture wars. It's just kind of an ongoing theme. And maybe once the baby boomers kind of pass, then we can kind of see something new evolve, a new zeitgeist. I would be very sad if the culture war continued on with the next generation. It's past time for it to die out, in my opinion. Yeah, I wish I could remember more of the conversation I had with him, because I don't remember all of the details. I remember the broad outline of it, but I don't quite remember the details of it. It's been too long, and I think I'd been reading about the 60s in particular before I had that conversation with him. So my memory of the period was more fresh than it is right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a better time. Things were better back then. Not so many people I loved being dead at that time.
Yeah.
It's much more exciting.
Yeah, mortality kind of sucks in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it kind of pops up on you. Surprise.
One of the conversations that I had with Pact a little bit was about how fascism is something that obviously allowed, or motivated Germany rather, to expand and try and conquer and do all that stuff as much as they did. But most people who were alive during World War II are no longer alive. But the seductive nature of fascism to capitalist societies is still there. And it's kind of come back, but most people who are with the neo-Nazi type of movement, they haven't learned the lessons that Nazi Germany taught us because they weren't alive then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fascism is a very sexy ideology because it gives something to everybody. Communism is very divisive. It says there's this group of people They're wrong, they're evil, we need to get rid of them. Fascism does something similar as far as ethnic groups and things like that, but generally it's more international. Like, there's a difference between Nazism and just fascism. Nazism is a subset of fascism, but there are other types of fascism. Like Italian fascism, for example. Like Mussolini and Italian fascism was not nearly so focused on Jews or ethnic groups or etc. That was not really like a big part of the ideology, not nearly as much so as in Germany, where racialist thinking was much more prominent as part of fascist thinking. So when I say fascism is a sexy ideology, I mean it in the sense that it promises something to almost every group. So if you're a poor working man, fascism promises to give you work and to give you pride by way of your nationality and conquest. It promises the capitalist and the business owner profits and stability by way of corporatism. Corporatism is a big part of fascist ideology. And the idea there is basically to put order to chaos. You know, fascists want to give power to the state in order to control society in all ways, in order to provide stability and predictability, so that the force of society can be marshaled in international conquest and competition. And in that sense, fascism is very attractive to people because it offers to kind of solve the instability. Economic anxiety, well, fascism will fix that by controlling the companies, or at least de facto controlling the companies, by controlling competition. But it doesn't take power away from the business owners or the corporate owners, because you know, communism would do that. Communism, in contrast, wants to get rid of corporations and business completely, or at least to a large degree. Fascism skirts that by allowing business owners to keep their businesses, but they're heavily regulated in a way that gives the state de facto control over them. It's a crafty workaround, basically, and it makes fascism much more attractive because, unlike communism, it doesn't really seem to revolutionize society. It doesn't really seem to want to overturn everything. Communists were critical of business, of religion, you know, a huge swath of social norms and social institutions, as well as economic institutions. And that put them at odds with conservatives, social conservatives specifically. And that kind of worked to their disadvantage. Fascists, in contrast, were just as revolutionary. Fascism and communism are both revolutionary ideologies. But the fascist doesn't automatically create enmity amongst broad swaths of the population by attacking sacred cows, religion, things like that, things that a lot of people who would not otherwise be revolutionary would agree with. A lot of those things fascists don't attack per se. They say, don't get rid of them, control them, put them in the power of the state. And so in that way, they avoid offending the broader part of the population, and therefore fascism becomes more attractive. Fascism is also very attractive because it offers quick action. A lot of fascists, well, not all of them, but a good chunk of them in Germany were actually disgruntled communists. People who were fighting the class war and were tired of the lack of progress. The fascists, in contrast, were making a lot of progress. They would go out, beat the shit out of people in street wars, and would win votes. They were able to successfully translate violence on the street into political power and actually make changes to society. Unlike the communists, who perpetually just never seemed to make any ground, never seemed to make a lot of traction. So disgruntled communists would kind of defect. They would say, all right, well, they're not perfect, but at least they're taking on the system. At least they're exerting control over the businesses and corporations to some degree. And so those people would defect, and it bolstered the ranks of fascists. So that's another way in which fascism is attractive, and another way in which it's able to broaden its appeal to a diverse polity, basically, to diverse groups. It's very effective at doing that.
One thing that it also tries to do, kind of like you're talking about empowering pretty much everyone, at least the majority groups, is playing to the existing prejudice in the region, which that's going to vary some depending on where the fascist group is forming, but there are some overlapping themes like anti-Semitism being present in a lot of different fascist groups, like in the US, saying that the Jews are controlling the media and stuff, which to me just seems like, what the fuck? Where is that coming from? But there's the tradition of German fascism saying that the Jews are doing this and that in their propaganda machine, and a lot of that just kind of carrying over.
Yeah, well, anti-Semitism does have some root in the American Midwest, because that was more heavily settled by Germans. And for whatever reason, anti-Semitism has like a strong hold, historically speaking, in Central Europe. And that's another conversation, the sources of anti-Semitic sentiment in Europe. But that when Germans or other people from Central Europe migrated over to America, a lot of them settled in the Midwest, and so there's some sort of indigenous anti-Semitic sentiment there that in turn translates into anti-Semitism in the neo-Nazi movement here in the United States. And also some of that, like you said, is just the German influence. Nazism ended up being the poster child for fascism. And as a result, a lot of people who have, for whatever reason, an affinity for Nazism have taken on anti-Semitism as an innate part of the ideology. Yeah, it's unfortunate because fascism goes above and beyond just Nazism and anti-Semitism. Fascism can take on many different forms, depending on the society and culture in which it's operating in. And I think the emphasis on Nazism kind of distracts from other forms of fascism that take root and form, and it makes it harder to counter. You could almost call the Communist Party of China a fascist party, because at this point it's not very communist.
Yeah.
A lot of the communist tenets that they started with have been kind of abandoned, and at this point they look a lot more like the Kuomintang than they do like the original Communist Party of China.
What are some other ones that are active right now? Prominent fascist groups.
So specifically ones that are not modeled after Nazis.
Sure.
Yeah, I don't think you could find any, I don't think I could think of any off the top of my head that are explicitly fascist. But you can find groups that are trending in that direction. Like there's a group in South Africa called the Economic Freedom Fighters, who by and large right now are an anti-corruption party. There's nothing wrong with that. But some of their racial rhetoric is rather confrontational and has the potential to expand into kind of the degree to which it could be considered fascist. Not there yet, but there's potential.
Are they like pro-separatist? They think that the different communities should be separate from each other? Because that's a big point for a lot of the American fascist movements, is we don't want to live with them or next to them.
Yeah, basically that. It's basically an anti-white. It has an anti-white element to it. Again, they're not quite there yet. It'll be a while, if at all, but it has the potential. Zimbabwe has a fair amount of fascism in the form of the Mugabe administration. Obviously, a lot of Islamists, radical Islamists, can be considered fascists, mostly in the Middle East. You could consider pan-Arab nationalist authoritarian governments to be fascist. In fact, a number of them are actually modeled almost explicitly on fascist governments. The Thai military kind of skirts the line. The Thai military, which, by the way, right now, in case you don't know, Thai military has control of the Thai government. It launched a coup a couple of years ago, and it's never given power back to the people, so to speak. It hasn't reinstituted democracy yet. So the Thai military is a little bit suspicious of democratic institutions and tends to have a much more nationalist perspective of how the country's affairs should be run. And nationalism is a big part of the fascist perspective.
Yeah.
Even if that's a big part of the ideology in any country, wherever it takes form. There's a similar dynamic in Burma that's much more explicit. And in fact, Burma's probably was much closer to a fascist country than it is now. They've instituted democratic reforms, so they're not quite there anymore, but they're not far off. Burmese military has a very, very nationalist perspective, and has a very intolerant view of certain minorities, specifically the Rohingya, whom are this sort of Muslim group in southwestern Burma that has been targeted explicitly by the government or more accurately, the military, in order to bolster support for the military. Burmese politics is a whole other discussion we could get into, but for now I'll leave it at that. People in India have been criticizing the BJP of being fascist. I think that's a bit of a stretch, but there are tendencies there. There are certain chauvinist tendencies in the BJP's rhetoric. More explicitly fascist is the RSS, which is kind of a radical Hindutva organization, sort of Hindu chauvinist party in India. They're, you know, if you see some of the footage of their training camps, it's not a stretch to say they're not far off from fascist.
What do you do at a training camp to make yourself more fascist?
Well, I mean, just the way they operate, the way they indoctrinate their people, the way they march them around, the way they dress in uniform, it's all vaguely fascist.
Oh, yeah.
And that's to say nothing of the ideology, which is very revisionist, very nationalist, kind of all the tenets of fascism are kind of there. Also, one of their guys assassinated Mahatma Gandhi, so kind of gives you an idea of how extreme they are, or can be anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, almost every country has some group that borders on fascism, if it isn't outright fascism. But we don't really talk about it like that because fascism has been defined in terms of Nazism, and that particular brand of fascism is mostly, almost exclusively in Europe. And in some very strange places.
It's interesting.
I never thought there...
Go ahead.
Well, I never thought there would be neo-Nazis in Russia, for example.
Yeah.
But there are.
Yeah. There was a GIF that was one of the top ones on high quality GIFs. Something about an Eastern European person is in one of the neo-Nazi groups in the US, and they were like, "You are dumb. You are really dumb."
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah, it's just very bizarre. And it's not just in Russia either. You know, the Ukraine has them. In fact, there's a whole battalion of people, or at least a good chunk of that battalion in Ukraine, fighting in the war there. That's people who are explicitly far right and have fascist sympathies. Mm-hmm. And I think the reason Eastern Europeans, Slavic people, basically, well, some of them anyway, have sympathies for Nazism is not so much sympathy for Nazism per se. It's more the nationalism. It's more the pride in country. You know, they see the rabid nationalism as being useful, if not admirable. Mm-hmm. Nazis themselves, maybe not so much, but the ideology of pure, unvarnished nationalism, I think that's what they find attractive. Yeah, Israel has neo-Nazis, if you can believe that.
Wow. Talk about self-loathing.
Well, I think that comes from the migration that came from Eastern Europe and Russia after the Soviet Union collapsed. There was a big migration of Eastern European Jews into Israel after that in that period of history, and so I think it kind of stems more from them. Also, some of them I think took advantage of Israel's rule, which is Israel has this law that's designed to make it easy for Jews to migrate to Israel. And the way it's written, you can get into Israel even if you have a very loose heritage. Like if you had some far-removed relative who is Jewish, technically you can still get in based on that, even if you yourself are not a practicing Jew or even identify as Jewish. Mm-hmm. And so some people who got in on that, and because they weren't really Jewish, for them, some of those people didn't really have a problem with being neo-Nazis, apparently.
I'm not even mostly Jewish.
Yeah, make of that what you will, but it just speaks to the allure of fascism to certain types of people. Mm-hmm. And again, that just goes back to what an attractive ideology it is. You know, there are just some groups of people who are innately attracted to that type of thinking.
I think there was a question about Sri Lanka.
Tell us some stuff about the Sri Lanka conflict. Yeah, so Sri Lanka was actually a part of the British Empire. It was not made part of independent India because it was, even within the British Empire, it was not a part of the British India and that administration. It had its own separate government. So after World War II, when countries started getting their independence, Sri Lanka was considered separate from India and so received its independence separately and became an independent country. So far, so good. The bulk of the population has historically been ethnically Sinhalese, whom are actually kind of more related to people in North India, which is weird because they're not anywhere near North India. But anyway, that history aside, the bulk of the population, I think more than 2/3, is ethnically Sinhalese. But what happened was the British started, what was it? It was like tea plantations in the northern and eastern part of Sri Lanka. And in order to have people to work on those plantations, they actually imported workers from South India, specifically Tamil workers, people who were ethnically Tamil. And so ethnic Tamils comprise a minority population in Sri Lanka, again, mostly in the northern and eastern parts of the state. None of that was really a problem until the 1960s, 1970s. And at that point, opportunistic politicians started using ethnicity and ethnic identity as a crutch, basically to win votes. And the long-term effect of that was to create ethnic animosity that eventually resulted in a civil war. And this is a truncated history of this, by the way. It's been a while since I've read about it, so I'm probably missing some details. But basically, that's the gist of it. Politicians kind of caused the Civil War, basically, by being morons. And then, yeah, again, long and short of it. And so that led to the creation of a group called the Tamil Tigers. And the goal of the Tamil Tigers was to create an independent Tamil state, to take the Tamil parts of Sri Lanka and carve them out and to make an independent Tamil state. And it's called something like Tamil Nadu or something. I don't quite remember the name they were going to call it. So the Tamil Tigers started fighting, I think, around 1980. And a little bit of trivia for you, they were one of the first groups to propagate suicide bombing. And I think they actually might have done it before even the jihadis in the Middle East started doing it. But they were in a very effective rebel group. The Sri Lankan government was not overly wealthy, and so they didn't have quite a strong enough military to quite put them down. And so effectively, the Tamil Tigers actually succeeded in expelling the Sri Lankan government and its military forces from Tamil areas, and effectively seizing control of them. The Sri Lankan government never quit fighting, though, and so there was basically back and forth fighting for the better part of 30 years, up until about 2010, thereabouts. And it was at that point that the Sri Lankan government started getting more money from the commodities boom that happened in the, from 2000 to 2010, roughly. That led to an influx of money into Sri Lanka, as well as the United States and other countries giving the Sri Lankan government more money because of the whole counterterrorism shtick. The Tamil Tigers were considered one of the world's premier terrorist organizations because they did use a lot of suicide bombing and terrorist tactics. So as part of the broader war on terror, the United States started giving some support to the Sri Lankan government. So those two factors combined facilitated a large military buildup by the Sri Lankan army, and that's what eventually allowed them to kind of break the stalemate. They were able to take back territory from the Tamil Tigers and eventually defeat them outright in a rather bloody campaign that ended in, I think, around 2010. It was looking like it was going to be a Pyrrhic victory for a while, because the guy who was president of Sri Lanka during that period was a guy named something Rajapaksa. And he was kind of an autocrat. He was a little bit authoritarian. And he very much based his legitimacy of his rule was based on his cracking down on the Tamil Tigers, building up the military and kind of fighting back, so to speak. Previous leaders were seen as weak on the Tamil Tigers and in prosecuting the civil war. Rajapaksa, in turn, was kind of sold himself as a strong man. And he built up the army, and eventually, because he was able to win the war, he had a lot of popularity. But because he was a chauvinist, a Sinhalese chauvinist, along with a good chunk of the electorate there, unfortunately, a lot of the policies that were implemented in occupied Tamil territories were oppressive. They were not conducive to long-term peace, basically. And for a while, it looked like the Tamil people would be right back where they started, where they felt oppressed and marginalized, such that they would start another rebellion probably like 10 years, within 10 years, which had been my prediction. I just figured, given that the government was not really reconciling the Tamil population with the government, that they were just kind of continuing to do things that were oppressive and violent and, killing people, etc., that would inevitably lead to another civil war. But in a shocking development, in the Sri Lankan election a year or two after the civil war ended, a couple years after, Rajapaksa actually lost the election and was ejected from power. And he actually lost to one of the people who had been in his political party, who turned on him because he thought he was being too authoritarian. And I don't remember this guy's name. I think it was something like Sri Vina. I think he's still in power in Sri Lanka, actually. This guy successfully ran on basically removing war powers that the Sri Lankan government had accumulated, and also paring down the influence of the Rajapaksa family, which of course had become enriched and powerful because of corruption in the Rajapaksa government. The new guy, again, I think it's Srivena, successfully just undid that, and his policies towards the Tamils have been much more conciliatory. And so it's looking like now Sri Lanka will actually avoid civil war and might actually be able to successfully reconstruct its economy and reconcile the two major ethnic groups.
Maithripala Sirisena.
There you go, that's the guy. And major props to that guy, because he's definitely the guy that country needed at that time. Continued Rajapaksa rule would have not only been bad for the prospects for another civil war, it would have been bad for Sri Lankan governance, since he was kind of monopolizing power. But the new guy here, Sirisena, much better in that regard. Better at governance, better at reconciling with the Tamils. So, kind of the best of both worlds. They had a guy who was strong enough and crazy enough to beat the Tamil Tigers, and then they got rid of him and brought in the guy who was nice enough and cool enough to successfully take advantage of the opportunity provided by the successful end of the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
So the best of both worlds, and what's the word I want? Optimal outcome. That was kind of the optimal outcome.
Nice.
Still some problems in Sri Lanka, but much better now.
Well, cool. We're right around 8 hours for the stream. It's been a good session with Aegis Smith once again. Thank you for all the questions and praise for him and support of the stream and all that. We'll be back again next Sunday. We've been doing these every Sunday, and all of them are being uploaded to the YouTube channel. Just search Neuro Agent Smith, and it should come up. You have to wait a whole week, I know. He's the best, but he's got to do his stuff too. But thanks again for coming on. Always a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Always a lot of fun.
And thank you, Packed Facts, for streamlining this whole process. And we'll see you all next time in the Neuro Fam.
Cool.
GG.